in the positions of others.
Yeah, we finished P9 because we got 5-second penalty for track limits.
I stop the car, man. The brakes don't work. Pedals to the floor.
Charles button on.
Surely there's no penalty when it's force majeure. That's one of the first times, not the first time I've had brake failure. That's definitely difficult. So to lose the points, but yeah, I was trying.
Yeah, definitely. We have a strong recovery there. Strong race overall. And back to the pit lane.
What would you do if your car loses the brakes in the middle of the race and you still miss 20 laps in the most demanding circuit of the calendar? That was exactly what Lewis Hamilton faced in Singapore. And the most incredible ended the race adding points. But the price he paid was very high. Ferrari arrived in Singapore with an SF25 that dragged doubts from the beginning of the season. It is not simply a lack of performance. It is more deep, a structural deficit that affects from the chassis to thermal management through the braking response and the balance in slow curves. While other teams like McLaren and Mercedes advanced with aggressive improvements, Ferrari had already made it clear that he would not make significant changes during 2025. It was a frozen car in time, and Hamilton knew it. There was no place for miracles, but for the effort. All this turns his participation in this race into a survival journey. It was not about fighting for victory. It was about staying on the track, managing an unpredictable car, and squeezing each curve as if it were the last. At other times of his career, Hamilton has had the car faster. No here. This time, everything depended on his raw talent, his temper in the adversity, and resistance forged throughout 7 world championships. The Singapore GP, with its brutal technical and physical demand, became a mirror where both the car's shortages and the greatness of those who piloted it were reflected. Because when the environment is more hostile, it is where we really discover who is still a true gladiator of the track. From the moment the traffic lights in Marina Bay went out, it was clear that this would not be a standard Grand Prix for Lewis Hamilton. The exit was clean, but his grid position already marked the tone, an intermediate point between hope and threat. It was not among the pointers, but neither sufficiently enough to run without pressure. Each pilot in front of him was a barrier between him and the goal of adding valuable points for Ferrari, a team that once again seemed to have arrived without the necessary weapons to compete at the highest level. The first laps were a dance between defense and attack. Hamilton, aware of the weaknesses of the SF25, opted for a conservative strategy at the beginning. Avoid the aggressive curbs that could compromise the integrity of the car, conserve tires on an abrasive track, and maintain a stable rhythm while analyzing its rivals. But that lasted little. As the race advanced, the Ferrari began to show its mechanical limitations. The thermal management failed, the brakes began to heat more than normal, and the traction in slow curves, a persistent weakness of the SF25 since its birth, became increasingly evident. It was from lap 42 when everything changed for Hamilton. The effectiveness of its braking system began to degrade dangerously. He could no longer stop precisely. He was forced to lift his foot from the accelerator ahead of time, enter with less confidence in the deceleration areas, and delay defensive maneuvers. That deficit not only made him vulnerable on the track, but also pushed him to make increasingly risky decisions. To compensate for the loss of performance, the edges of the circuit began using the edges. Not by strategy, but for pure need. Each curve became a high-risk area. I was forced to stretch the rotation radios, to look for grip where there was not, to improvise line after line to hold the rhythm. That inevitably led him to exceed the track limits repeatedly. In the heat of competition, these actions did not seem criticism. Hamilton was still within the top 10, defending his position with a mixture of tactical intelligence and pure experience. But after the checkered flag, the blow came. The commissioners reviewed their behavior and determined that it had exceeded the permitted limits. The verdict was a 5-second sanction, and in a race as tight as Singapore's, those 5 seconds were lethal. He was relegated from a 7th to 8th place, losing a position against Fernando Alonso, who had had a cleaner race, although also very suffered. During all that final stand, Hamilton maintained the SF25 on track with a committed brake system, high internal temperatures, and an almost no level of adhesion in certain areas. Even so, he did not abandon. He did not throw in the towel. And that has a huge symbolic weight, especially in a championship where the results are the most valuable currency and team confidence can stagger after each error. The 2025 Singapore Grand Prix did not offer great headlines for Lewis Hamilton in terms of results, but he did deliver something that only trained eyes can detect. A silent, brave, and deeply significant action in what was, without exaggeration, one of his toughest careers in recent years. When we break down your performance, two clear layers appear. On the one hand, the negative aspects which are obvious in the records, a car that did not respond, a rhythm limited by technical failures, and a penalty that lowered it from a 7th to an 8th position. But on the other hand, there is a deeper, more intangible layer where Hamilton stands as a symbol of resistance within chaos. A hero between the shadows. Cons are indisputable and reflect the technical decline of SF25. From Vuelta 42, the braking system lost effectiveness. It was not a mild degradation, but a critical loss that forced Hamilton to completely adapt his driving style on the march. In a circuit like Marina Bay, where the precision in braking is everything, this is equivalent to running with an arm tied to the back. I couldn't attack. I couldn't defend. Each curve was a threat, and yet he continued. The second great defect was the lack of traction of the SF25 in slow curves. This is not new, but it became much more evident under the thermal punishment of Singapore. In areas where other cars could accelerate with confidence, the Ferrari slipped, generating constant losses of time and extra wear of the tires. Hamilton had to anticipate, constantly recalculate, and find the balance between the possible and what was safe. I wasn't fighting to win. I was fighting to survive. The 5-second penalty was the last nail in the race, but it was not a deliberate infraction. It was the reflection of a pilot who pushed beyond the reasonable to maintain his position. He exceeded the track limits because he needed to compensate for the lack of braking, because staying online meant being advanced. It was not a trap. It was sports despair. And yet, after the sanction, there were no complaints. There were no incendiary statements. Hamilton accepted punishment as part of the price of competing to the limit in impossible conditions. When talking about a broken car, reference is not made to possible mechanical failures or weekend configuration errors. No, it is a deep failure in the very concept of the vehicle. And the SF25, despite having been developed with the accumulated data of the battle against McLaren in 2024, fails to solve its weak points. In fact, it has dragged them and even accentuated one of the most frustrating characteristics of the car is its slowness in reaching the optimal temperature of the tires. This phenomenon, known as poor thermal warming, means that the car takes too long to bring the rubber to its ideal operating window. In practice, this translates into initial turns without grip, with instability in traction, and subviring in curve entrance. For a pilot like Hamilton, who bases much of his style on the precision of late braking and passing through controlled curve, this defect is a direct dagger to his driving philosophy. To this is added the already chronic lack of traction in slow curves. Ferrari seems to have prioritized the efficiency in peak speed and medium aerodynamic load, sacrificing mechanical grip in low speed areas. And in Singapore, where 80% of the curves are low and medium speed, this is not a weakness. It is a competitive death sentence. Every time Hamilton tried to get out of a slow curve, the SF25 reacted slowly, slid, skated. Each return was a fight to avoid flying, to hold a car that did not want to adhere to the asphalt. The energy management of the car also lets you desire. The hybrid system, although efficient in recovery, has a little aggressive linear power delivery, which reduces explosiveness in short lines and affects overtaking opportunities. In circuits where the overflows are defined for tenths of a second in curve outputs, this detail is not less, it is decisive. And if that were not enough, the brakes do not support long sessions with high temperature. What happened in Singapore with Hamilton was not an isolated case. It is an emerging pattern. Rear brake cooling seems subimmense for urban circuits, and compound material has faster thermal fatigue than expected. From Tour 40, that system began to fail, and Lewis had to compensate with changes in its piloting. Not with technology, not with strategy, with instinct. There are careers that are won with spectacular overtaking, others with millimeter strategy. But there's a much more difficult type of career to value, that which is won by pure survival. And that was exactly what Lewis Hamilton did at the 2025 Singapore Grand Prix. because while statistics place him in the 8th final position, far from the podium, the reality is that what we witness was an exhibition of silent strength. A resistance that does not appear in the performance graphics, but that defines the greatness of a pilot rather than any trophy. Hamilton did not pilot a winning car, nor a competitive one. He piloted a broken, unstable, limited car. And yet, he chose not to surrender. He chose to fight. Each curve was a decision calculated between stopping earlier than usual or risking a track exit. Each meter was a negotiation with a car that did not respond. Each return was a lesson of tempering and self-control. And this is where one of the hardest questions of this sport is raised. Is Hamilton living your rebirth in Ferrari, or is you simply trapped in a red, painted prison? Because if we analyze it coldly, the team is not fulfilling its share of the treatment. They gave him a seat, yes. They gave him history, passion, a brand with symbolic weight. But they have not given him a car with which he can fight for what really brought him back, win. And at this point in his career, Hamilton is not here to add 8th positions. He is here to close his legacy at the top. Ferrari's choice was not impulsive. It was emotional. It was symbolic. It was an act of faith. But every career like Singapore erodes that faith. Each mechanical failure, each aerodynamic limitation, each sanction for forcing a car unable to stay within the track limits, all that weighs, and one cannot avoid asking if the pilot who marked an era with Mercedes is slowly devoured by the shortcomings of a structure that has not proven to be ready to sustain his historical weight.